This isn't some story I made up for the internet. This is a real thing that happened to me, a moment from my life that I've replayed in my mind 1,000 times, and it all started at a party that was supposed to be the best night of my life. The crystal award in my hand felt heavier than it looked, its sharp edges digging into my palm as I stared at him across the crowded rooftop bar. He had the same predatory smile, the one that used to make me feel chosen but now just made my stomach clench. Julian Vance, the ghost I thought I'd finally escaped, was standing at my promotion party, raising a glass of champagne in a toast that was meant to look like a celebration, but I knew was a declaration of war. He thought he had come to remind me that he was the architect of my success. He had no idea I was about to introduce him to the man who was financing his demolition. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. 5 years earlier, Julian and I were inseparable. We were the golden couple of Chicago's cutthroat architecture scene, two rising stars at Vanguard Designs. We shared a loft in River North with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the churning, gray-green Chicago River. We shared dreams, blueprints, and a bed. Our love story was built on a foundation of shared ambition, sketched out over late nights fueled by lukewarm coffee and the electric thrill of creation. We were going to build empires together, etching our names into the city's iconic skyline. He called me his muse, his partner, his equal. I believed him. I was young, brilliant, and so deeply in love that I couldn't see the rot in the foundation. The project that broke us, and almost broke me, was the Odyssey Tower. It was my baby, a concept I'd been nurturing since my graduate program at the Illinois Institute of Technology. It was a twisting, biophilic skyscraper designed to be a living lung for the city, with spiraling sky gardens and a revolutionary energy recycling system. It was audacious, beautiful, and my entire soul poured onto paper. Julian was assigned as my co-lead on the project pitch. At first, it was perfect. Our synergy was electric. We'd spend hours debating the merits of a specific composite material or the precise angle of a load-bearing wall, our arguments always melting into a passionate consensus. But slowly things began to shift. It was subtle, like the slow creep of a shadow. He started presenting our joint ideas in meetings as his own singular insights. As I was conceptualizing last night, he'd begin, outlining a solution I had proposed just hours before over takeout noodles. When I'd gently correct him later, he'd laugh it off, his hand finding the small of my back. "We're a team, Ellie. What's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. It doesn't matter who says it, as long as it gets done." He made my desire for credit seem petty, like I was undermining our partnership. He was so charming, so convincing, that I started to believe him. I started to shrink myself to make more room for him. The final presentation for the Odyssey Tower was to a panel of billionaire investors. It was the biggest pitch of our careers. The night before, Julian told me he should take the lead. "You're brilliant, Ellie, you are," he said, tracing the line of my jaw with his thumb. "But you get nervous. You rush. Let me be the showman. I'll sell our vision. I know how to handle these sharks." I was hesitant, but he framed it as a strategic move for our benefit. He was the confident, charismatic frontman. I was the quiet genius behind the curtain. It was a story as old as time, and like a fool, I bought it. I sat in the second row of that sterile, intimidating boardroom at the Aon Center, watching him. He was magnificent. He spoke with a passion and authority that mesmerized the room. He presented my designs, my research, my words, as if they had sprung fully formed from his own mind. He used the pronoun I so many times I lost count. My vision for this tower, my solution to the zoning problem, my revolutionary approach to sustainable urban living. I felt a cold dread pooling in my stomach. I wasn't his partner. I was a footnote he'd forgotten to erase. When the lead investor, a crusty old real estate mogul named Marcus Thorne, asked a highly technical question about the helix structure's wind shear resistance, a problem I had spent 3 sleepless weeks solving, Julian answered flawlessly, using the exact explanation I had given him. He never once looked at me. They awarded us the contract on the spot. Champagne was popped. Backs were slapped. Julian was lifted up as the new wunderkind of Chicago architecture. And me? I was the girl who'd helped him. His talented assistant. The next day, our firm's internal memo congratulated Julian Vance on his singular achievement in securing the Odyssey Tower project. My name was mentioned once in a list of the support team. 2 weeks later, Julian accepted a senior partnership at Sterling Price, the most prestigious and ruthless firm in the city. His signing bonus was rumored to be 7 figures. He took the Odyssey Tower project with him as his flagship design. When I confronted him in our half-packed loft, surrounded by cardboard boxes, he didn't even have the decency to lie. He was packing his books, my books, into a box labeled Julian. "Ellie, be realistic," he said, not even looking up. "You're a phenomenal designer, but you don't have the killer instinct. I do. I took our dream and made it a reality. You should be happy for us." "For us? There is no us, Julian. You stole my work. You erased me." My voice was shaking with a rage, so profound it felt like it would tear me apart. He finally turned to look at me, and his expression was one of genuine pity. It was the most insulting thing I had ever seen. "I didn't erase you," he said softly, as if speaking to a hysterical child. "I elevated your work. It would have stayed in your notebook forever if it wasn't for me. I gave it a platform. You'll get another chance. You're talented." He picked up his leather satchel, the one I had bought him for his 30th birthday. "This is just business. Don't be so emotional." And with that, he walked out of my life, leaving me in the ruins of our shared dreams, with his name on the cornerstone of my soul. The humiliation was a physical thing, a sickness that settled deep in my bones. He hadn't just stolen my project. He had stolen my confidence, my voice, my past, and my future. He left me with nothing but the echo of his footsteps and a portfolio that felt like a book of ghost stories. The years after Julian left were a long, slow climb out of hell. Vanguard Designs, my own firm, became a minefield of whispers and sideways glances. I was the jilted girlfriend, the woman who couldn't handle the pressure, the one who'd been carried by her more talented boyfriend. The Odyssey Tower, now under construction and managed by Julian at Sterling Price, became a constant, gleaming monument to my failure, its skeletal frame rising into the sky just a few blocks from my office window. Every news article that praised its visionary design, every magazine cover featuring Julian's smug face, was a fresh twist of the knife. He was lauded as the new messiah of modern architecture, while I was relegated to drafting bathroom layouts for suburban office parks. The bitterness was a cancer. It soured everything. I became withdrawn, quiet. I poured all my energy into my work, but the spark was gone. My designs were competent, solid, but they lacked the fire that had defined the Odyssey. Julian had taken that from me too. He had convinced me that my brilliance was only valid when filtered through him. The change, when it came, wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow burn, ignited by a single infuriating spark. I was scrolling through LinkedIn late one night, a masochistic habit I had developed to keep tabs on his ascent. He had just won the Pritzker Medal for Emerging Architects. There was a link to an interview with Metropolis magazine. The title was Julian Vance, Building the Future on a Foundation of Integrity. The hypocrisy was so staggering I almost laughed. I clicked the link. I read his words, his philosophies on design, and felt a familiar, sickening churn. They were my words. He spoke about architectural empathy, a term I had coined in my thesis. He discussed the symbiotic relationship between structure and environment, lifting phrases verbatim from conversations we'd had over dinner. But it was the last line that finally broke the dam of my apathy. The interviewer asked him what his guiding principle was. He smiled for the camera and said, "I believe a building should be more than just a structure. It should be an honest story told in glass and steel." An honest story. The man who had built his entire career on the biggest lie of my life was preaching about honesty. In that moment, the grief and humiliation that had been my constant companions for 3 years finally burned away, leaving behind something cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear: rage. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of our breakup. It was a focused glacial fury. He hadn't just stolen my past, he was actively stealing my future, my very identity as a creator. He was still building his kingdom on my ruins. And I decided in the sterile blue light of my monitor that I was done being a ghost. It was time to start the demolition. My resolve was forged in that quiet moment of fury. I wasn't going to get even. Getting even was for amateurs. I was going to get biblical. I was going to dismantle his empire, brick by stolen brick. And I was going to do it so precisely that by the time he realized what was happening, he'd already be standing in the rubble. The first step was to stop being the victim. I went into my boss's office the next morning. Mark was a decent man, but he was cautious, and he'd been treating me with kid gloves ever since Julian left. I laid out a plan to build a new experimental design division within Vanguard, focusing on small-scale, high-impact sustainable projects. I presented market analysis, potential revenue streams, and a portfolio of new concepts I'd been secretly working on at night. Designs that were mine and mine alone. Mark was stunned. He saw a flicker of the woman he had first hired, the hungry, brilliant designer who had been dormant for so long. He gave me a shoestring budget and a team of 2 junior architects. It was a start. For the next 2 years, I worked with a singular monastic focus. I was the first one in the office and the last one to leave. My team and I started winning small but prestigious awards for our work. A green-roofed community center in Pilsen, a kinetic art installation for Millennium Park. I was slowly, painstakingly rebuilding my reputation, not as Julian Vance's ex-girlfriend, but as Elara Thorne, an innovator in my own right. I was becoming known for my meticulous attention to detail and an almost fanatical devotion to material integrity. My name started appearing in the same trade magazines as Julian's, albeit in smaller font. The real opportunity, the one I had been waiting for, arrived in an email blast from the city of Chicago. It was a request for proposals for the Celestine Grant, the largest urban redevelopment project in a decade. The city wanted to transform a desolate stretch of abandoned industrial land along the south branch of the river into a new, futuristic tech and residential hub. It was a legacy project, the kind that could redefine a career. It was my new Odyssey Tower. I went straight to Mark's office and told him I wanted to lead the pitch. Not as a co-lead, as the sole lead. He agreed without hesitation. I dove into the project with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I knew this was my one shot. I also knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Julian and Sterling Price would be bidding for it. He was drawn to prestige like a moth to a flame, and this was the biggest flame in the city. He wouldn't be able to resist. My assumption was confirmed a week later when Crane's Chicago Business ran a piece announcing Sterling Price's bid, with Julian Vance personally overseeing the project. The article quoted him as saying his design would be an evolution of the principles he established with the Odyssey Tower. Of course it would. He only had one playbook, and I was the one who wrote it. This was my chance to face him on a level playing field. But I knew I couldn't just have a better design. His reputation, built on my stolen foundation, was immense. He was the industry darling. I needed more than a blueprint. I needed a weapon. I started researching the Celestine Grant Committee, the people who would be making the final decision. The committee was headed by one man, the project's primary private investor, Alastair Finch. Alastair Finch was an enigma. He was the CEO of Finch Enterprises, a global logistics firm, but he had a deep passion for architecture and urban planning. He was notoriously private, rarely photographed, and known in business circles for 2 things: his uncanny ability to see through corporate nonsense and his absolute, unwavering demand for integrity. Reading his interviews and profiles, I felt a spark of hope. He wasn't some old-money dinosaur. He was sharp, forward-thinking, and he despised fraud. He was my key. I started moving in his circles. It wasn't easy. He didn't frequent the usual schmoozy industry events. I found out through a contact that he sat on the board of a small, under-the-radar arts foundation that supported emerging local artists. I bought a ticket to their annual fundraising gala at the Art Institute of Chicago. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, nothing flashy. I didn't try to corner him. I just made sure I was in his orbit, speaking intelligently with the museum curator about the new exhibit on Bauhaus design. He approached me near the end of the evening, by a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. "You're Elara Thorne," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was calm and deep. "I've been following your work on the Pilsen Community Center. Your use of reclaimed timber was thoughtful." I was floored that he even knew who I was. We talked for 20 minutes, not about the Celestine grant, but about architecture, art, and the soul of a city. He was brilliant, incisive, and he listened with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. There was an immediate, undeniable chemistry, an intellectual spark that was more intoxicating than any physical attraction. That conversation was the beginning. We met for coffee the next week, which turned into a 4-hour lunch at the Gage across from Millennium Park. He was fascinated by my design philosophy, the one Julian had stolen and repackaged. I told him about my belief in architectural honesty, that a building's materials and design should reflect its true purpose, without artifice. I was reclaiming my own language, and he was hanging on every word. Our relationship grew organically from there. It was professional at first, a mentorship of sorts, but it quickly deepened into something more. He was the first man since Julian who saw me, the real me, not a reflection or an accessory. He admired my mind, my passion, and my resilience. He knew my history with Julian. I had told him everything, not as a plea for pity, but as a statement of fact, context for the fire that now drove me. He listened, his expression hardening as I spoke, and when I was finished, he simply said, "Men who build their legacies on stolen ground eventually find themselves in the sinkhole." By the time Vanguard submitted our proposal for the Celestine grant, Alastair and I were quietly, seriously involved. It was a risk, I knew. If it ever got out, people would say I'd slept my way to the top. But it was real. For the first time in years, I felt whole. And with Alastair's quiet support, I had never been more confident in my work. My proposal, titled The Confluence, was the best thing I had ever designed. It was a masterpiece of innovation and integrity, and it was entirely mine. The day of the final presentation arrived. It was held in the same intimidating boardroom at the Aon Center where Julian had betrayed me 5 years ago. This time I was at the podium. Julian and the Sterling Price team were presenting right after me. I could feel his eyes on me from the back of the room as I sat up. He had a look of smug amusement on his face, the look of a champion watching a challenger he knows he can beat. I began my presentation. I spoke about my vision for a community built on transparency, connection, and sustainability. I laid out every detail of the confluence, my voice steady and strong. I was no longer the nervous girl in the second row. I was a creator, a leader, a force. When I finished, Alastair, sitting at the head of the long table, opened the floor for questions. Another committee member asked a complex question about the project's hydrological impact on the riverbank. As I gave my answer, I noticed a junior architect from Julian's team frantically whispering to him, showing him something on a tablet. Julian's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then dawning horror. He was looking at my design. He was looking at a style he thought he owned, now evolved and perfected into something he could never hope to achieve. He was looking at my ghost, fully resurrected, and about to drag him to hell. When it was his turn to present, he was visibly shaken. His pitch, a polished but soulless echo of the Odyssey Tower, felt dated and hollow after mine. He stumbled over his words, his usual easy charisma replaced by a desperate, brittle energy. He knew in that moment that he had already lost. He just didn't know how badly yet. 2 weeks later, Vanguard Designs was officially awarded the Celestine grant. My promotion to senior project lead was announced the following day. I had won, but the war wasn't over. The final battle was yet to come, and I had the perfect location picked out, my promotion party. The party was in full swing at the London House Chicago rooftop bar. The glittering panorama of the city skyline spread out before us, a sea of light and shadow. The very buildings that had once intimidated me now felt like colleagues, silent witnesses to my return. My team from Vanguard was there, so were my boss's industry contacts and a few close friends who had stuck by me through the dark years. Alistair was by my side, his presence a warm, solid anchor. He wasn't there as Alistair Finch, the powerful CEO. He was just my partner, his hand resting comfortably on the small of my back, proud and supportive. I was giving a small speech, thanking my team and holding up the crystal award Mark had just given me, when I saw him. Julian. He was standing near the entrance, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, a confident smirk plastered on his face. He hadn't been invited. Of course he hadn't. His presence was a calculated intrusion, a power move designed to unsettle me, to remind me and everyone else that my success was somehow still tied to him. He wanted to cast his shadow over my moment of triumph. He made his way through the crowd, which parted for him like he was royalty. He still had that aura of unearned success. People were whispering, pointing. I felt a familiar cold knot tighten in my stomach, but I forced it down. This was not the Aeon Center boardroom. I was not the girl in the second row anymore. I finished my speech, my voice not wavering, and set the award down on a nearby table. Ellie, congratulations, Julian said as he reached me, his voice smooth as silk, but his eyes holding a glint of condescending amusement. Senior project lead. I always knew you had it in you. You just needed the right opportunity. The implication was clear. He thought I'd won some minor project, a consolation prize, while he remained the king. He had no idea it was the Celestine grant. News of the winning firm hadn't been made public yet, only the internal announcement of my promotion. He was here to gloat, to play the part of the magnanimous ex who was so successful he could afford to be gracious. Julian, I said, my voice dangerously calm. How unexpected of you to come. I wouldn't miss it, he oozed. We may have had our differences, but I'll always be your biggest fan. I feel a certain pride, you know, like a mentor watching his protégé finally spread her wings. He was laying it on so thick it was suffocating. He was performing for the people around us, creating a narrative where he was the generous creator, and I was his humble creation. This was the moment, the culmination of 5 years of pain, work, and white-hot fury. I gave him a smile, a real one, and it felt like baring my teeth. Julian, there's someone I'd like you to meet, I said, turning slightly to Alistair, who had been watching this exchange with a quiet, predatory stillness. This is my boyfriend, Alistair Finch. Julian's eyes flickered to Alistair. He offered a hand, his politician's smile still in place. A pleasure. Julian Vance. Alistair took his hand, his grip firm, his eyes like chips of ice. He didn't smile back. I know who you are. A flicker of confusion crossed Julian's face. The name Finch was clearly ringing a bell, but he hadn't placed it yet. He was searching his memory, trying to figure out which corporate board or golf club he knew him from. I decided to help him. Alistair is the head of the Celestine Grant Committee, I said, my voice clear and precise, cutting through the nearby chatter. A small circle of silence was expanding around us as people began to sense the tension. He was just telling me how much he admired my proposal, the confluence. He's always had a passion for originality in design. The color drained from Julian's face. It was magnificent. It was like watching a skyscraper collapse in slow motion. The smugness, the confidence, the condescension, it all crumbled away, leaving behind the stark, ugly architecture of panic. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost the biggest contract of his career. He had lost it to me, and the man who held the power of that decision was holding my hand. He snatched his hand back from Alistair's as if he'd been burned. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The mask was gone. I was looking at the real Julian, a weak, terrified thief caught in the act. Alistair wasn't finished. He took a step forward, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable authority that commanded the attention of everyone nearby. Mr. Vance, he said, the words clipped and sharp. Your proposal for the Celestine project was familiar. In fact, after reviewing it, I took the liberty of looking into your work on the Odyssey Tower as well. Ms. Thorne's early, time-stamped concept files from her time at Vanguard were far more compelling. Integrity is the foundation of any good structure, wouldn't you agree? A collective gasp went through our small audience. It was no longer just a breakup drama. It was a public execution. Julian was sputtering, trying to form a sentence, but no words came out. His entire reputation, the very core of his public identity, was being dismantled in front of his peers, his rivals, and the people he had spent years trying to impress. I delivered the final blow. Vanguard's legal team is launching a full intellectual property review of the Odyssey Tower design. I said, my voice void of all emotion. They're very interested in my original drafts. It seems building a career on a faulty foundation can have structural issues down the line. Julian just stood there, crucified by the weight of his own lies. The whispers around us were growing louder. He looked from me to Alistair and back again, his eyes wild with desperation. He saw no mercy in my face, only the reflection of his own ruin. Without another word, he turned and practically fled, pushing his way through the crowd of stunned onlookers who now stared at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. I watched him go, the ghost that had haunted me for 5 years reduced to a pathetic, fleeing man. I didn't feel elation or joy. I felt quiet, a profound, deep, and chilling quiet. The noise of the party resumed around me, but for a moment, all I could hear was the silence of a long-overdue debt being paid in full. Alistair squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement. I picked up my crystal award from the table. It felt surprisingly light. He had built his career on my stolen dream, and tonight, standing in the city we both wanted to conquer, I finally sent him the eviction notice. The end.